I got a call from my wife at 11:43 on a Thursday night, and the first thing she said was, "If anyone asks, I'm at my sister's." I actually laughed because I thought she was joking, but then I heard a man's voice in the background, low and close, and the line went dead before I could say her name. That was the exact second my normal life ended. 5 minutes earlier, I was on the couch half watching a playoff game, still wearing my work boots, thinking about whether we had milk for the morning. Then I was staring at my phone like it had turned into a weapon. My wife, Emily, had been acting off for weeks, maybe months if I'm being honest, but I kept sanding down the rough edges of every red flag. Because that is what men like me do when we are terrified of being right. We call it stress, we call it distance, we call it a phase, we call it anything except betrayal. We had been married 9 years, together for 12, and I used to think that counted for something. Lately, she had become impossible to hold on to, like every conversation slid right through my hands. She guarded her phone like it contained nuclear codes, smiled at messages she never explained, and kept telling me I was too intense anytime I noticed the obvious. 2 nights before that call, I asked her why she turned her screen away when I walked in, and she gave me this flat little smile and said, "You know what your problem is, Ryan. You always need a villain." I remember standing there feeling stupid for even asking, while she kissed my cheek like I was some needy child and said, "I'm tired, babe, not guilty." Then she disappeared into the shower with her phone in her hand. I hated how quickly she could make me doubt my own eyes. I hated that it worked. After the call, I checked our phone bill for the first time in my life, and that is when the floor really gave out under me. One number kept repeating over and over. Early mornings, lunch hours, nights, she swore she was with family. And the contact wasn't saved in her phone because I had looked before and found nothing. She had deleted everything, but she forgot the bill existed. I called the number from my work phone, and a man answered on the second ring. He sounded relaxed, comfortable, like I had interrupted his evening. I said, "Who is this?" And he went quiet for half a second before asking, "Who's asking?" That was bad enough. But then I heard something in the background that made my stomach drop so hard I had to grab the kitchen counter. It was my wife laughing. Not nervous laughter, not forced laughter. The real kind. The kind I had not heard in my own house in almost a year. When I whispered, "Emily," the line cut off instantly, and 10 seconds later my front door unlocked. She walked in pale, breathless, eyes already filling with anger instead of fear, and said, "Why were you calling him?" Then I noticed the key in her hand was not her car key. It was a house key, and it sure as hell wasn't ours. She was still holding that key when I looked up at her, like she hadn't even realized what it meant yet. Like it was just another thing she could talk her way out of. And I remember my voice sounding completely unfamiliar when I said, "Who is he, Emily?" Because I wasn't asking anymore. I was already past that point. I just needed to hear what lie she was going to choose. She blinked at me like I had just insulted her, like I was the one who had done something wrong, and she shook her head slowly, almost disappointed, and said, "I cannot believe you went through the phone bill, Ryan. That is such a violation." And I actually laughed because it was so absurd I didn't know what else to do. I just pointed at the key in her hand and said, "You just walked into our house with another man's key and you're talking to me about violation?" And her expression hardened instantly. That softness she used to have just gone, replaced with this cold, controlled tone I had been hearing more and more lately. She stepped past me like I was in her way, dropped her bag on the table and said, "It's not what you think," which is the oldest line in the world and somehow still hits like a punch when it's your life. And I followed her into the kitchen because I couldn't just stand there. I needed answers even if they were lies. And I said, "Then tell me what it is." And she turned around so fast it almost made me flinch and said, "It's someone who actually listens to me." Like that explained anything. Like that justified the late nights, the secrecy, the call I just heard. And I felt something crack inside me because that wasn't denial. That was defense. That was her already choosing him over me without even saying it out loud. I asked her straight, "Are you sleeping with him?" And she didn't even hesitate. She just scoffed and said, Of course that's where your mind goes. That's all you ever think about. Control and possession. And I swear for a second I almost believed her again. That reflex to doubt myself was still there. But then I said, "Put him on the phone right now." And she froze, just for a second. Just enough to confirm everything she was trying to twist. And then she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You don't get to demand anything from me anymore." And that word anymore echoed in my head like a gunshot because it meant this wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake. This was something that had already replaced me before I even realized I was gone. I told her I had already spoken to him, that I heard her in the background. And that's when the mask finally slipped just a little. Not guilt, not remorse, just irritation, like I had made things inconvenient for her. And she said, "You shouldn't have called that number," in this quiet, warning tone that made my stomach twist because it sounded less like a wife and more like someone protecting a secret I wasn't supposed to touch. And I said, "How long?" And she didn't answer. She just picked up her phone and started typing like the conversation was already over, like I didn't matter enough to even lie to properly anymore. That's when my phone buzzed in my hand, and I looked down expecting something from her. But it wasn't her. It was my best friend Mark, and the message was just one line that made my chest go completely hollow. "Hey man, I think you should know Emily's been coming by my place a lot lately, and it's not what you think." I was still staring at that message from Mark when Emily finally noticed the change in my face, and for the first time that night she looked uncertain, not guilty, just thrown off that something had shifted outside of her control. And she said, "What now?" Like she was already exhausted by me, like I was the problem interrupting her evening, and I held up my phone without even realizing my hand was shaking and said, "Mark just texted me." And the second his name left my mouth, something flickered in her eyes that she tried to hide too fast, something sharp and defensive, and she said, "Okay," and like it meant nothing. Like my best friend of 15 years was just another random name in a long list of people she could brush off. I read the message out loud, word for word, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything she had said all night. Like the room itself was waiting for her to pick a version of the truth that would hold together. And instead of answering me, instead of denying it, she rolled her eyes and said, "You're really going to do this right now?" And I felt my chest tighten because that wasn't confusion, that wasn't shock, that was annoyance. Like I had just exposed something she hadn't planned to deal with yet. And I stepped closer and said, "Why is my best friend texting me about you going to his place?" And she snapped back instantly. Maybe because he's the only one who actually listens when I talk. And I swear that sentence hit harder than anything else, because it echoed exactly what she had said about the other guy. Like they were interchangeable. Like I had already been replaced in multiple directions and I was the last one to realize it. I called Mark right there, put it on speaker, and when he answered he sounded nervous in a way I had never heard before. Like he already knew this moment was coming and had been dreading it. And I said, "Tell me what you meant." And there was this long pause where I could practically hear him thinking about how much damage he was about to do. And then he said, "Ryan, it's not like that, man. She just comes by sometimes to talk." And Emily let out this quiet, almost mocking laugh under her breath and said, "See?" Like that proved something, like I was crazy for even questioning it. But I didn't hang up. I just stayed silent because I've known Mark too long. And I know when he's lying. I know the exact tone he uses when he's trying to soften something ugly. I asked him, "How long has she been coming over?" And he hesitated again. And that hesitation told me more than any answer ever could. And then he said, "A few months." And everything inside me went cold, because that meant every late night, every excuse, every time she told me I was imagining things, she was somewhere else building something I wasn't part of. And I looked at her and said, "Were you with him tonight?" And before Mark could even respond, she cut in sharply, "Hang up the phone." And there was something different in her voice now, not defensive, not annoyed, but controlled, like she was trying to contain the situation before it got worse. I didn't hang up, I just stared at her, waiting, and Mark finally said, "Ryan, I think you should come talk to me in person." And that was it. That was the moment everything twisted into something even worse than I thought. Because now it wasn't just one man. It wasn't just some random stranger. It was my best friend asking me to come over like there was more he wasn't saying. And when I looked back at Emily, she didn't look scared. She looked angry, like I was about to ruin something important to her. And that terrified me more than anything else because it meant whatever was happening between them, I was already the outsider. I didn't even remember grabbing my keys. I just remember the sound of the door slamming behind me and Emily shouting something I couldn't make out. But it wasn't, "Wait," or "I'm sorry." It sounded more like frustration, like I was derailing her night instead of catching her in a lie that was swallowing our entire marriage. And the drive to Mark's place felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life, replaying every conversation, every excuse she ever gave me. Every time Mark sat across from me with a beer in his hand and asked how things were going at home, nodding like he cared while apparently knowing more about my wife than I did. When I pulled up outside his house, his car was already there, lights on, like he had been expecting this, like he knew I would come the second he sent that message, and that alone made my stomach twist, because it meant this wasn't spontaneous, this wasn't concern, this was planned in some way I didn't understand yet. And when I knocked, he opened the door almost immediately, not surprised, not confused, just tense, like a man bracing for impact. And the first thing he said was, "Come inside," in that low, careful tone people use when they think they're about to deliver something heavy. I didn't sit down, I didn't take off my jacket, I just stood there and said, "Start talking," because I didn't trust myself to hear anything if I gave him the comfort of time, and he ran a hand through his hair and said, "Ryan, it's not what you think." And I actually laughed again, same hollow sound as before, and said, "Then you better come up with something better than that. Because right now, I think my wife is seeing two different men behind my back, and one of them is you." And he flinched, not dramatically, just enough to confirm that I had stepped closer to the truth than he wanted. He shook his head quickly and said, No, it's not like that with me." And I stepped forward, close enough that he had to look me in the eye, and said, "Then why is she here?" And that's when everything inside me froze, because I hadn't even realized I was asking that question until I heard it out loud. And the silence that followed was loud enough to feel like the house itself was holding its breath. And Mark didn't answer right away. He just looked past me for a second, toward the hallway behind him. I turned before he even spoke, and that was the moment something inside my chest just collapsed completely. Because there, standing halfway down the hallway like she had been listening the entire time, was Emily, barefoot, wearing one of his shirts, arms crossed like she was already tired of the confrontation. And she didn't look ashamed. She didn't look caught. She just looked done with me, like I was the last problem she needed to clean up. I couldn't even process it at first. My brain just kept rejecting what my eyes were telling me, and I said her name like a question, like maybe there was still some version of reality where this made sense. And she sighed, actually sighed, and said, "I told you to hang up the phone." Like that was the issue, like the problem wasn't where she was or who she was with, but the fact that I had forced this moment to happen before she was ready. I looked between them, my best friend and my wife, standing in the same house like they belonged there together, and I asked, "How long?" again. But this time my voice was barely there, and Mark opened his mouth like he was going to speak, but Emily cut him off instantly, sharp and cold, and said, "Don't." And then she looked straight at me and said something that made everything spiral into something even worse than betrayal, something I wasn't prepared for at all. She said, "You really still think you're the only one I've been lying to?" I stood there staring at her, trying to understand what she had just said, and it felt like my brain was lagging behind reality, like everything was happening half a second too fast for me to catch up, and I said, "What does that even mean?" But my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded smaller, like something had already been taken from me that I couldn't get back, and she just shook her head slowly, like I was disappointing her again, like I was still not seeing the bigger picture she had already accepted. And she said, "It means you've been behind for a long time, Ryan." And that sentence hit in a way I can't even explain, because it wasn't just betrayal. It was her rewriting our entire relationship like I had been irrelevant in it for months, maybe longer. Mark tried to step in then, Like he suddenly remembered I was his friend too. Like he hadn't been standing there silently while everything collapsed, and he said, "Man, listen, it's not like we planned this." But I cut him off immediately because hearing him say "we" made something snap in me, and I said, "Don't talk like that. Don't stand there and act like this just happened." And he backed up a step, hands raised slightly, like I was the one escalating, like I was the threat in the room. And Emily just watched us with that same cold expression, like she had already checked out of whatever this was supposed to mean to me. I looked at her again and said, "Are you with him?" nodding toward Mark. Because I needed something clear, something simple, and she didn't answer right away. She just crossed her arms tighter and said, "Why does it matter now?" And that was the moment it really sank in that she wasn't even trying to protect what we had anymore. She wasn't even pretending. And I felt this wave of humiliation hit me so hard. I had to look away for a second because standing there felt like being exposed in a way I couldn't control. Like I had been the only one still believing in something that had already ended without me. I asked her again, slower this time, "Are you with him?" And she exhaled sharply and said, "I'm with whoever actually shows up for me." And that answer was so deliberately vague, so carefully designed to avoid the truth while still cutting me down, that it made me realize she had been doing this for a long time, not just lying, but shaping every conversation so I would doubt myself before I ever doubted her. And Mark finally said, "She's been staying here sometimes," like he thought that would soften it, like phrasing it gently would change what it meant. And I just stared at him because this was the same guy who helped me move into my first apartment, the same guy who stood next to me at my wedding. And now he was talking about my wife staying in his house like it was some casual arrangement. I felt sick, not even angry yet, just sick, and I said, "And the other guy?" And Emily's head snapped toward me instantly, that first real reaction, and I knew I had just hit something she didn't want exposed, and I said it again. "The one I called tonight, who is he?" And she looked away this time, just for a second. But it was enough. And Mark looked confused, genuinely confused, like this was new information to him, and he said, "What other guy?" And that was when everything shifted again. Because now it wasn't just me being lied to. It was him too. I watched her carefully, waiting, and she shook her head like she was tired of all of us, like we were the problem. And she said, "You're both making this bigger than it is." And I actually felt my hands clench because that was the same line she used on me every time I got close to the truth. And now she was using it on both of us, trying to control the narrative in real time. And I said, "Put him on the phone." And she didn't move, didn't reach for her phone, just stood there, silent, calculating. That silence told me everything. Because for the first time, it wasn't just me realizing I didn't know my wife anymore. It was Mark realizing it too. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but I pulled my phone out again and hit redial on that number without breaking eye contact with her. And the second it started ringing, Emily's entire posture changed. Not panicked, not guilty, but sharp, alert, like I had just crossed a line she wasn't ready for me to cross yet. And she said, "Ryan, don't," in this low, controlled voice that made it sound less like a request and more like a warning. And that alone told me I needed to keep going, because for the first time all night, she actually cared about stopping me. Mark looked between us, confused and tense, like he was realizing this situation was bigger than whatever he thought he was part of. And I said, "You said it's nothing, right? So let's clear it up." And the phone kept ringing, one tone after another, stretching the silence tighter and tighter until it finally clicked, and someone picked up. And I put it on speaker without saying a word. "Hello?" The man's voice came through again, calm, almost bored, like this was just another call in a normal night. And I said, "Yeah, it's me again." And there was a pause, a longer one this time, and then he said, "You really shouldn't be calling this number." Almost the exact same tone Emily had used earlier, and I felt something twist inside my chest because it sounded coordinated. Like they had already had this conversation about me before I even knew it existed. I said, "Where were you tonight?" And he let out a quiet breath, like he was deciding how much to say. And then he replied, "You already know enough." And before I could push further, Emily stepped forward and said, "Hang up." Louder this time, sharper, but I ignored her and said, "Say her name." And that was when the line went completely silent. Not disconnected. Silent. Like he was still there, listening, choosing not to answer. And that silence was louder than anything he could have said. Mark looked at Emily, then at me, and said, "What the hell is this?" His voice cracking slightly because now he wasn't on the outside anymore. Now he was standing in the same place I had been in just an hour ago, realizing the story he believed wasn't the whole truth. And Emily just shook her head, frustrated, like we were both inconveniencing her, and said, "You're both overreacting, it's not that serious." And I actually felt something dark rise up in me when she said that, because there we were, her husband and the man she was staying with, both looking at her for answers, and she was still trying to minimize it, still trying to control it. I lowered the phone slowly and said, "How many?" And she didn't respond, just looked away again. And that was enough. That hesitation, that refusal to even deny it. And Mark took a step back like he had just been burned, shaking his head, muttering, No, you said it was just us." And Emily snapped back instantly. "I never said that." Cold, precise, like she had been careful with her words all along so she could stand here now and twist them however she wanted. I felt this hollow realization settle in my chest, heavier than anger, heavier than betrayal, something colder, and I said, "You've been playing both of us." And she finally looked at me directly. No denial, no apology, just that same detached expression, and said, "I've been surviving." Like that justified everything, like we were just obstacles she had learned to manage. And that's when Mark said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Ryan, I think you're the only one who doesn't know about the apartment." "The apartment?" I repeated. And I could actually hear my own voice breaking on that word, like it didn't belong in my life, like it was something from someone else's story that had somehow landed in mine. And Mark immediately looked like he regretted saying it, like he had let something slip that he wasn't supposed to. And Emily closed her eyes for a second, not in shame, just in irritation, like now things were getting messy in a way she didn't plan for. And I stepped closer, my chest tight, and said, "What apartment?" Because at that point I wasn't even asking calmly anymore. I needed something solid to hold on to before I completely lost control. Mark ran a hand over his face and said, "Man, I thought you knew." And that sentence hit harder than anything else so far, because it meant there were entire parts of my wife's life that other people assumed I was part of, things so real and established that my ignorance wasn't even considered. And I turned to Emily and said, "Tell me he's wrong." But she didn't answer. She just leaned back against the wall like she was tired of standing, like this whole thing was exhausting for her. And that silence confirmed it again, louder than any confession. I felt this pressure building in my head, like everything was stacking too fast, and I said, "You have another place." And she finally looked at me and said, "It's just somewhere I go sometimes," so casually, so dismissively, like she was talking about a coffee shop, not a second life she had built without me. And I shook my head, trying to process it, and said, "With who?" And she gave me that same look, the one that made everything feel like my fault, and said, "Why does it have to be about someone?" And I almost laughed, because at this point that line meant nothing. It was just another way for her to dodge the truth while making me sound unreasonable for asking. Mark stepped in again, quieter this time, like he was piecing things together in real time, and said, "Em, you told me you were staying there because things were bad at home." And she snapped back, "They were bad," without even looking at him. Like that justified everything. Like the state of our marriage was a free pass for whatever she had been doing behind both our backs. And I said, "So you've been going between him, this place, and our house, like it's nothing." And she didn't deny it. Didn't even react, just crossed her arms again and said, "You're simplifying it because that's easier for you." I felt something in me finally shift then, something colder, more focused, because this wasn't confusion anymore. This was a pattern, a system she had built where she controlled every version of herself depending on who she was with. And I said, Where is it? And she hesitated, just for a second, and that hesitation told me it mattered, that this place wasn't random, it was important. And I stepped closer again and said, "Where is the apartment, Emily?" And she looked at me with that same tired, almost bored expression and said, "You don't need to know that." Like I was a stranger, like I had no right to the truth about my own life. That was when Mark spoke again, quieter, almost reluctant, and said, "It's downtown, near my place." And I turned to him slowly, because that detail changed everything. It meant this wasn't just random, this wasn't scattered. This was planned, organized, close enough for her to move between us without friction. And I asked him, "How do you know that?" And he swallowed hard and said, "Because I've been there." And my stomach dropped so hard it felt like I might actually collapse right there in his living room. I looked back at Emily, waiting for anything, any denial, any explanation that made this less insane. But she just met my eyes and said, "Don't look at me like that," like I was the one crossing a line, and I whispered, "You built a whole life without me." And she didn't even flinch, just tilted her head slightly and said something that made everything spiral even further out of control. She said, "You were never really part of it to begin with." I don't even remember breathing after she said that. It just felt like something inside me shut down completely, like my body decided it couldn't process another word without breaking. And I stood there staring at her, searching her face for anything familiar, anything that resembled the woman I thought I married. And there was nothing, just this calm, distant version of her that looked at me like I was a problem she had already solved. And I said, "Then what was all of this?" My voice barely holding together. "What was our marriage?" And she exhaled slowly, like she had been waiting for me to finally ask the question in the right way. Mark didn't say anything now. He just stood off to the side, completely silent, like he understood he wasn't even part of the main story anymore, like he was just another piece I hadn't known about. And Emily pushed herself off the wall and walked a few steps closer to me. Not gently, not cautiously, just confidently, like she wasn't afraid of what I might do or say. And she said, "It was comfortable." And I felt that word hit deeper than anything else, because it reduced everything, years of my life, every memory, every sacrifice, into something temporary and convenient for her. I shook my head, trying to fight through the fog in my chest, and said, "You lied to me every day." And she didn't even deny it. She just said, "I told you what you needed to hear so things wouldn't fall apart," like she was explaining a strategy, not a betrayal. And I realized then that this wasn't chaos to her. This was control. This was something she had been managing carefully, balancing people, places, stories, making sure nothing collided until now. Until I forced it. I asked her one last thing, the only thing that still mattered in that moment. "Do you even care?" And for the first time, she paused, just slightly, like she was considering how honest she wanted to be. And then she said, "I care about not losing everything," and that answer told me more than anything else could have, because she didn't say she cared about me. She didn't say she cared about us, just everything, like I was just one piece of a system she didn't want to collapse. I felt something settle in me then, something final, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding that whatever I thought I had, whatever I believed in, had been gone long before tonight. And I looked at Mark, then back at her, and said, "You didn't just betray me. You built an entire life around lying." And she didn't argue, didn't defend it, just looked at me like I was finally catching up. I turned toward the door, not because I knew what came next, but because I knew I couldn't stay there another second, and as I reached for the handle, she said my name. Not softly, not emotionally, just enough to stop me. And I hesitated for a split second before looking back at her. And what she said next made me realize this still wasn't the full truth. She said, "If you walk out right now, there's something about you that you're never going to find out."